JavaScript is a nearly perfect programming language. The only thing it's missing is a good framework for building websites. Now, I've got a body count like Wilt Chamberlain when it comes to JavaScript frameworks. I've tried nearly all of them and each one does some nice tricks, but none of them are marriage material. They all have their trade-offs, which I'll explain throughout this video, so you can understand what drives a developer to the point of madness, where they're left with no choice but to create their own JavaScript framework.
It's alive!
In my case, God told me to do it. Allow me to introduce you to Holy.js. Actually, never mind. Somebody already took that name on NPM. Let's go ahead and pivot to the devil and call it Flamethrower. I think that really captures the essence of JavaScript programming. Now, at this point, you may be wondering if I'm joking. The sad reality is no. I did actually create a game-changing platform for building blazingly fast, highly interactive experiences on the Jamstack. I also raised millions of dollars for my company Flamethrower Inc. to hype it up. I stole 99% of my ideas from other tools, but I'm going to tell you that everything else sucks, give it an MIT license, and then call you out if you try to steal it. So one day I might be as successful as Remix. Alright, that part was a joke about some Twitter drama, but what I really want to teach you in this video is the trade-offs between all the different major JavaScript frameworks out there. Here's the normal flowchart I would go through when choosing a framework for a new project. The first question to ask is the project highly interactive? Like, are you building an app with user authentication with all kinds of data that can be manipulated by the current user? If the answer is no, it sounds like you're building a regular website, in which case you don't need a JavaScript framework. Life will be much easier with a static site generator like Hugo or Levity, and if you do end up needing JavaScript, you can always drop in something like Alpine or Petite View, as opposed to a heavyweight framework. Or an even better option could be Astro, which generates static HTML, but allows you to bring in interactivity from any framework as needed. Now, if you are building a highly interactive app, the next question you might ask is, does it need to be search engine friendly, or does it need to render HTML and data on a server? If the answer is no, then just use your favorite framework to build a single page application. If you don't need to render content in advance for search bots, then you can focus 100% on the front end UX. However, if you do need SEO, then your next question will be, how often does the content change? If it's like a blog where the content doesn't change very often, it sounds like you have a Jamstack application. It typically makes more sense to pre-render your content and cache it on a CDN, then allow a JavaScript framework to hydrate it and take over after the initial page load. Frameworks like Next.js and SvelteKit can do this in SSG mode, but you also have tools like Gatsby that are dedicated to this use case, although it's kind of fallen from grace recently. Now, if your content is highly dynamic and constantly changing, then you'll likely need full server-side rendering to regenerate the static content on the server whenever a new request comes in. This is what tools like Next.js, Nuxt, and SvelteKit are designed to do. And if you're not exactly sure how your project is going to evolve, I would default to a full SSR framework. That gives you a simple framework for choosing the right framework, but things can get a lot more complicated from here. What I'm building is a platform to host my courses. It requires user authentication and is highly interactive, and also needs to have really good SEO. The content doesn't change all that often, so that would lead us to the Jamstack option. I started working on the project with SvelteKit, which is an awesome framework, but is more general purpose and doesn't have a ton of features for content management compared to something like Hugo. That leads to the question of, how do I manage tons of content? One option is I could stick with SvelteKit and just re-implement all these content management features on my own. Don't get me wrong, I love reinventing the wheel as much as the next JavaScript developer, but one other issue is that I'm worried these frameworks won't be fast enough when rendering a lot of Markdown. The creator of Levity made a good benchmark comparing them. Option B would be to pay for a headless CMS like Contentful or Sanity, but then I have to add another paid service to my stack. Strapi is another good option that you can self-host, but then I have to manage a separate server and database just to manage my content. What I really want to do is just write all my content in Markdown and manage it in a Git repository. GitHub is actually an awesome free content management system for developers, although that's not its intended use. That line of thinking takes me back to static site generators, which are the best at handling Markdown and templating. Astro seems like a perfect choice here, but it brings up one other question, which is, how do I share data or state between different routes? On Astro, you'll notice that when you navigate, you get a full page load for each route. That means the JavaScript reboots, and even if you use something like Nano stores or Svelte stores, the information from the previous route is lost. It's not like Next.js where the client-side router takes over and renders the UI with JavaScript on all routes after the initial page load. This can be a problem if you're managing authentication state with JSON web tokens in something like Firebase and want to show the current user up in the nav bar along with some data from a database that might update in real time. time. So basically, that leads us back to Next.js or any other framework that fully hydrates after the initial page load. There's also new cutting-edge frameworks like Quick and Solid Start that could be good options in the future, but I just need to get this project done as ASAP as possible. And of course, the most efficient way to do that is to build your own JavaScript framework. The question that led to this is, how do I take a static site and share JavaScript functionality and data between routes with zero latency on the page transition, and without the need for a framework to take over the entire DOM? In other words, I want a SPA-like router for static sites, and that's basically what I built. It has zero dependencies and relies entirely on browser native technology like Fetch. A long time ago, when I first started working as a web developer, there was a library called PJAX that would asynchronously fetch fragments of HTML from your server and update the DOM rather than do a full page reload. This approach evolved into a library called TurboLinks, which is still very popular today and receives more NPM downloads than most JavaScript frameworks out there. The way it works is when you click on a link, it prevents the default behavior, then uses fetch to grab the page you want to navigate to. It swaps out the body of the page, then updates the head with the delta or changes on the new page. That means if you already executed JavaScript on the previous page, like a global state management library, it doesn't need to be re-executed on the next page load. That's really interesting behavior, and I'll explain why in just a minute, but was the main inspiration for my framework. Well, actually, it's just a library technically. The reason I didn't just use TurboLinks is because it's rather large and does a bunch of stuff that I don't really need. And there's a few special features that I wanted to add to my library to create a truly next-gen holistic platform. One of the biggest things that annoys me about modern web development is that when you're building a big content-driven site, 99% of the UI is static HTML that doesn't do anything. However, the common approach is to take this HTML and manage it 100% in a JavaScript framework. There are some definite benefits to doing that, but it requires all kinds of special tooling, things like virtual DOM, and requires you to stay married to just one framework. As a polygamist, I demand more from my framework. We can actually take an entirely different approach that's natively supported in all browsers using web components. A lot of people like to talk shit about web components for various reasons, but basically it's just a browser API for creating custom elements that encapsulate their own JavaScript and CSS. There are frameworks dedicated to building web components like Lit and Stencil, but all the major frameworks can compile to web components as well. One awesome thing about web components is that you can use them anywhere like regular HTML elements. You can even use them in Markdown without any extra plugins or dependencies. On top of that, you can use them between frameworks. For example, I could build a web component with Svelte and then access it from a React and Angular app. In my case, web components are awesome because I can use a static site generator, then add interactivity to my templates by simply declaring my custom elements. It's kind of like the islands architecture where you have islands of interactivity, but one thing to keep in mind is that web components will never be server rendered, they're only rendered on the client. Although interestingly, you can project server rendered content in a web component, which I think would be perfectly indexable by search engines. Now here's where things get really cool. When you combine web components with the router, they render instantly between route changes. What I have here is a statically generated site with a counter web component generated by Svelte that gets its data from a Svelte store. When the router is disabled, it does a full page load and the current count is lost when we go to the next page. Now if we enable the router, notice how the count data is not lost between route changes, just like a single page application. Not to mention the page transition feels much faster for the end user. In this codebase, I have an 11t project, inside of which has an extra app directory that contains a Svelte app configured to compile to custom elements. From a development standpoint, the only thing you really need to do differently is define a tag for each component. Then you export each component individually. The last thing I'm doing is starting the flamethrower router by calling it as a function. The router has a couple of extra features that you wouldn't find in something like TurboLinks. For one, it will find all of the visible links on the page and automatically tell the browser to prefetch them. The browser will automatically download these pages in the background so they're ready to render as soon as a user clicks on a link. That's made possible with prefetch link tags, and I also use the intersection observer API to only prefetch the links that are visible on the screen, because those are the ones the user is more likely to click. In other words, as you scroll down, it will lazily prefetch the links that come into view. If you want to see the actual latency between route changes, set log to true, and it will add a timer to every fetch operation. It should be blazingly fast, like well under 100 milliseconds. In addition, I threw in a little bonus feature that takes advantage of the new page transitions API. This API isn't supported in browsers yet, and you'll need to enable it with a flag, but basically it allows you to animate natively between page transitions, kind of like you would expect in a native mobile app. As you can see, by default, it does a crossfade animation. The bottom line though is that this router has allowed me to create my own little meta framework using Svelte compiled to web components, along with Hugo, a static site generator, which gives me awesome CMS features with extremely fast builds, with routing that feels like a single page application. That's pretty much it. The real question is,
who's coming with me? Who's coming with me? Who's coming with me?
This is a proven technique and used on big sites like Dev2 with Turbo, but currently Flamethrower is in meme status, and I wouldn't recommend using it in production until it reaches alpha. I have the luxury of doing weird experimental stuff like this, but if you're building a serious app for yourself, don't go chasing waterfalls, stick to the libraries and frameworks that you're used to, like Next, SvelteKit, Astro, and so on. Now that I've hyped up my game-changing JavaScript framework, my next step is to abandon it, then ask for donations via Open Collective to start an SEO link farm, which is the most reliable way to fund open source. I've got to feed my family somehow. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.